all the great leaders of Europe, they're all gone.
They're
It's
all gone.
just, and he essentially mocks Europe now. Like, who do you have? Von der Leyen, Callas. I mean, it's just a horror show of terrible leaders making terrible decisions. So the great leaders of the past, they're all gone. And
This is no comfort at all, but in 1989 at Fort McPherson, when I first joined Colin Powell, he gave me a lecture in this, and he told me indubitably this was going to happen.
that Europe would end up with horrible leaders.
Yeah, he just come back. You may recall his job before he was called back by Reagan was Fifth Corps commander in the Fulda Gap, where the group of Soviet forces Germany was going to pour through, and he only spent 6 months over there. But Powell never spent 6 months anywhere where he didn't go to school, and he went to school on what was happening in Europe. So he comes back and he's the national security advisor, the deputy, then the national security advisor. Then he leaves and becomes Forces Command commander. And I joined him 1989, April 1989. And in his office, within a week, he's telling me it's going to happen. Europe, he didn't have much faith NATO would last because he said Mitterrand, Major, Thatcher, Kohl, they're all gone. You know what's going to replace them, Larry? People who have no conscience, people who have no sense of reality, people who have not been seasoned by warfare that killed 100 million people, people who think they control their lives but don't, people who think they have a political process that works but it doesn't. He went through all this stuff. And at the end of it, I'm a fresh caught lieutenant colonel. I don't know what to say. I have no idea what he's talking about, really. And then I got to thinking about it later, and we came back and had subsequent conversations, and he convinced me he was right. That was at the same time that we had people like Bob Gates, yes, the chancellor of my university now, the guy who wrote Call of Duty, the great Secretary of Defense, calling him on the phone and telling him to shut up, that he had to stop, that the bear would be back, that the Soviet Union was not going away. This is 1989. The Soviet Union's not going away. You should shut up. You're a four-star general. You have no business out there saying things like, what does the devil do? What does the preacher do when the devil dies? You know, that was his standard line at that time. And he would then say, when people would look at him and say, what's he talking about? What does the preacher do when the devil dies? He was talking about the Soviet Union is gone, and we're the preacher. I mean, the guy was prescient in many respects, and he predicted Europe would fall apart.
Yeah, well, George Kennan, he wrote something similar around 1987 that if the Soviet Union would sink into the sea, then the shock would be too great for for the American society because it was all built up around this military confrontation, not just domestically, the economy, but the alliance systems of NATO. Everything had been reliant on having this external threat. So unless one is willing to have massive reforms thereafter, give up the alliance system that is NATO or the military-industrial complex, one would have to find a new enemy rather quick or some other international disaster. But I don't want to leave that topic yet on Colin Powell because this is rather fascinating. I didn't know he made this prediction about the fall of Europe in this sense, but can you flesh it out? What is so wrong with the leadership? How could you see that that the leaders would be horrible as they are today? Because 20 years ago we still had something of quality here, but it's nothing like what we see today. I mean, the Merzes and Macrons, the Starmers, the von der Leyens. I mean, Kaja Kallas is the foreign policy chief of the EU. It's a bizarre reality we're living in. But how could he predict this? This is my question.
Well, I think a lot of it was the very first sentence of his book, My American Journey. We parsed over for some time, and Joe Persico, his co-writer, can tell you about that. I thought it was brilliant. I usually trust my instincts. That's how he started that book. Now, his instincts with regard to Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction proved a real problem for him. No one's perfect. But his instincts were that once the pressure was off, once that shibboleth of keep Russia out, the Germans down, and the US in, once that was no longer there, then there was no rationale for NATO. And once NATO started falling apart, that would be a political as well as a military debacle. And the political aspect of it would be aided and abetted by people who, as he put it, and this was really a graphic way to put it, people who had no cognizance of the war. They weren't, he put it this way, they didn't have their feet in the war, like Francois Mitterrand and Kohl and others. They were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old or so. None of these people have ever seen what Europe was like when it wasn't like it is today. That was his point. And he said the center can't hold in that kind of situation. That's one reason why we started immediately trying to get the Europeans to develop a 3,000 person brigade with equipment, training, and everything about it divorced from NATO that would be a separate European security identity, ESI, and they would manage it, and it would be used for whatever they wanted to use it for within the domain of Europe. Think the Balkans, for example. And it would not detract from NATO, nor would it be any way a part of NATO. Insignificant. 3,000 man brigade. I mean, yeah, insignificant. Germans couldn't even put that together today, but it would grow. It would grow over time. It would become a division, then maybe it would become a corps. Old lingo, the old-fashioned terms to talk about the army or the military. And it would have its aircraft, and it would have its industrial base and all that. And slowly but surely, maybe a 25-year period, NATO would go away, and Europe would assume its own security identity, and it would be effective, well-trained, well-supplied by their own arms manufacturers and so forth. Guess what Lockheed Martin and others were saying when Powell would talk to them offline about these kinds of things? Woo! Dangerous man. Dangerous man. We need to get rid of him, because he was talking about the same thing Eisenhower talked about in 52, 53, I guess it was, when he talked to the Association of American Newspaper Editors and says, this is humanity hanging from a cross of iron, this God-blessed Cold War. We wanted to get off of that. We wanted Europe off of that too. But as he put it, there's a base force you cannot go below because you cannot be disarmed. You cannot demobilize. Europe, you cannot demobilize. We cannot demobilize. But we can build this base force for both of us, go down to it. We'll have ours, thank you very much, and you'll have yours. And oh, by the way, we don't want any more nuclear weapons in the world. So we'll give you our nuclear umbrella. We'll protect you. We'll keep Article 5 if you want to with regard to nuclear weapons. We can work that out. All of this went away with Bill Clinton. Every bit of it went away with Bill Clinton. It didn't go away with his second Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry. Bill Perry was going to Moscow all the time trying to resurrect it, trying to get it going again and trying to get Russia to be a part of it. Didn't work. Bill left. But the Bill didn't left. The Bill that with his wife just refused to testify before the Congress. They're not worried about anything associated with, the law. They're worried about their own reputations because Bill is heavily involved in the Epstein affair, which, by the way, isn't even remotely where it should be right now. Bondi, Trump, they're not even corresponding with what the Congress ordered them to do minimally, because this Republican-dominated Congress didn't order them to do a whole lot, but they did order them to do something, and they haven't done a thing. There are hundreds of thousands of files that have not been revealed, and Bill Clinton is right there. Guarantee you.
But on this failure of Europe, is this why it's so addicted to this war in Ukraine that if the war ends, especially on favorable terms, that Europe can't really survive this? Or, I mean,
Well, first, there wouldn't
because
have
I'm
been
sorry, this is the first time I heard about this prediction by Colin Powell. This is so.
well, there wouldn't have been any Ukraine if we'd have gone along with what we were doing. There wouldn't have been any Ukraine. I remember the conversations we had about with the Russians, essentially about nuclear weapons, and Ukraine giving up the nuclear weapons as other SSRs did. In the course of those conversations, we talked about the European security identity and how it might merge with the Russian idea. And we might bring Russia for the first time into a real effective security arrangement in the continental mapped area that they existed, called Europe. I mean, from the Urals to the west anyway is Europe. And that was a big part of it. Bush the president fell off of that a little bit when he heard, I don't know if it was Cole or Mitterrand or someone. I remember one of the foreign ministers for one of the countries in Europe had a different idea about the pace with which Russia might come into the political organization as an observer, then a member, and then the military organization, perhaps in the same sequence. So Russia would actually be a part of NATO. But we were having, kind of domino fitting problems with how do you divorce NATO from the ESI from NATO, and at the same time incorporate Russia. Do you incorporate Russia in the ESI or in NATO? And I don't think truth be told, I don't think we ever solved that argument. I think we were chicken. We were going to leave it up to the Europeans.
Well, it's a good time to rethink some of the decision of the 90s as the post-Cold War world order is, well, falling apart, especially for the Europeans, because there were some paths we could have taken, which is now, I think the Europeans paid a heavy price because we wanted to make sure that the United States had a massive footprint in Europe as a way of keeping the continent more stable, functioning as a pacifier. I think the price for having America on the continent was essentially preserving a lot of the Cold War infrastructure, so NATO, which meant, well, unfortunately making an enemy out of Russia. But as the US now wants to leave Europe, it looks as if we can reopen some of those old options we had.
Look at how fast we went down, though. I mean, we really did go down fast. At one point, I remember having a meeting with Powell, and he was, should we stop this? Should we slow this down a little bit? Because we were taking the forces down in Europe pretty rapidly. Then, of course, we left, and it became a situation where, no, we don't want to build the forces back up. But what we want to do is keep places like Ramstein, which are absolutely essential to things like fighting China and other places in the world like Iran and the Southwest Asia problem altogether, the Levant, I should say. And so we looked at out-of-area operations as a way to keep, the alliance viable. Balkans did a real mess when Powell went in and told Bush that it would take 500,000 men in 10 years and lots of casualties to really stabilize the Balkans. Bush said, I don't have anything to do with that. Got accused of being, not paying any attention to the Balkans. So what does Clinton do when he comes in? Clinton goes over there and bombs Serbia for 78 days and makes Russia even madder. You can't make this stuff up. It was such a divergence from the original conception. And I'm not for a moment saying that everything we wanted to do could have been achieved had we just been left alone to do it, because you still would have the Europeans and you still would have people coming into the leadership positions in Europe that weren't steeped in the old days. You still would have had the normal cantankerousness of countries like France and Germany and Britain. There's no way you could say it would have been a better world, except to say that the approach in and of itself, an approach that I would sum up in one word: law. International law and individual nations' domestic law. and adherence to that law as much as humans can do, and configuring everything that we were doing based on that law, very importantly, based on international law. The court had to be given good feet. It had to be given more than just Samuel Taylor from Africa to digest. It had to be given somebody that was, not black and not African. All kinds of conversations went on about how we would make the law more a component of world affairs and more or less transport what we had said, men weren't angels, there would be no laws or governments, into the globe. And prevent things like came down the road later, like Rwanda and Sudan. And we had lots of conversations when he became Secretary of State, too, that looked back on the past and said, boy, I wish we'd done that, especially when we were working with Sudan to declare genocide in the South. And declared it. We got Bush to sign off on it, and what did it do? Nothing. So you can have the law on your side, and not achieve much, but it's better to have it on your side, I think.